mysterious people who have happened upon dead corpses randomly. What happened? On a drive to work early one morning I came down a hill to see a vehicle off in a field to my right. It was upside down and on fire, so I immediately stopped and called 911. As I was running up to the vehicle, I could see the driver still strapped in. He wasn't moving or screaming, so I could only assume he was already dead. I couldn't get to him because of the fire. I really struggled with that for a while. This is a tricky thing to get over. I was the first person to arrive at the scene of a brutal traffic accident. The driver in the vehicle was still alive, although in the moment I thought they were dead. The car had flipped upside down and all I could see was a silhouette of a lifeless body illuminated by dim street lights. It happened at night. All I could do was wait for the paramedics to arrive. They got the guy out and airlifted him. The whole thing happened about 150 feet from my front lawn. The next day there was a bunch of teenagers leaving flowers at the intersection because the kid had died at the hospital. I don't remember everything as it happened, and normally I have an almost photographic memory. I just recall bits and pieces. The whole thing fricked with me for years. I became more conscious behind the wheel and would stress out when needed to go on long trips. PTSD fricks with your mind, and it took years for me to come to terms with what I encountered. When I was living in San Francisco, there is a homeless person sprawled on the ground. I asked some passerby if we should call an ambulance, and the guy at the store we were near said the homeless person did this all the time to get tips. I got what I needed from down the street, and on my way back I saw him being zipped up in a body bag by some paramedics. I live up here now, but when I lived in San Diego my house in Hillcrest was right next to a huge parking lot. It was also a stone's throw away from the Central Hospital. It was pretty common for folks to get picked up on a 51/50 and then released and just wander to this lot. I was coming home from work one day and walked by this guy splayed in a really unnatural position, but with his arms curled up. A cop was literally rolling by right as I clocked the supine guy on the ground, and I instinctively pointed like, check this out. I walked up to the guy and immediately somehow just knew he was dead. The face hangs in just such an unnatural way, I guess. One of the cops was this older guy who I'd seen around for years, and he get out with a big this shit again. Sigh. He walked over to the guy on the ground and thumped his chest with his knuckles so hard I thought he was going to break his rib cage. He did it a couple of times. Someone told me later you have to hit this hard if you want to restart the heart. The two cops glanced over the corpse and then radioed him for EMTs. I didn't say anything to either of the cops and just went inside and watched from my window. I was still doubting myself and thought maybe the guy was just really passed out. But the EMTs came and zipped him into a bag immediately. This was probably back in like 2012, and it's still surreal to me. In a retirement home I walked into a room to an old man lying on the couch. I thought the old man was sleeping, so I shut the door. 2 hours later we saw paramedics walk into his room. We had a corpse turn up in the woods behind my house. There was an older gentleman that would always chop firewood from tree falls out there. One day he was hiking around, saw what he thought was a weird rock, turned it over, and it was a human skull. My house was right on the only access road, so when I came home from school there must have been like 60 cars out there. All Leos and paramedics, crime scene unit, etc. Some guy who had schizophrenia went out into the woods. It was an older gentleman that had gone missing a few years prior. They think he died of exposure and coyotes had gotten at the body because he was scattered around. Happened at my elementary school party back around 1998. We were having a party at this teacher's house with about 30 other kids and 4 other chaperones. There was a pool in the back that was about 8 feet deep. We were all jumping in and out of the pool, and it was dark out. Eventually the teachers told us all to come inside because it was almost time to go home. As we're all getting out of the pool there was still someone at the bottom and wasn't moving. One of the chaperones jumped in and grabbed him. He was already dead. The whole school had a memorial for him, and it was all honestly just a horrible time. Something similar happened to my mom. A big group of kids swimming in a dam/lake, and whilst they had adult supervision, there were a lot of them, so keeping track was obviously difficult and the water was muddy. My mom and a friend felt something tugging their legs and freaked out, so all the kids ran out of the water. Turns out one of the kids was caught in the reeds and couldn't swim up for air, so he was tugging for help. He drowned and nobody noticed he was missing until it was too late. She still feels horrible about it. A guy at my university was walking to class with his earbuds in and his hood over his head. He walked right across train tracks lost in thought while other people were screaming at him that the train was coming. I was about 2 minutes behind and saw the immediate results of this guy not paying attention. It's a weird feeling, the matter-of-fact nature of seeing a dead person. It's not like anything else changes. The train stopped, the people who saw it were horrified, and the police came. But before the end of the week, no one at the school was even talking about it. In my second year at university, my good friend at the time went missing for 2 days, and after getting the warden to come with me and check his room, we found him dead. He had committed suicide in the 2 days I hadn't seen him. What still haunts me is that my last message to him was, "Hey man, you still alive?" in a joking way. Safe to say I've never sent anyone a message like that again. One of my parents worked for hospice as a social worker. She was not a nurse, so she didn't do any care of the patients other than being a mediator and giving some counsel. I remember one night she got a phone call in the early hours of the morning that she was needed because the patient had passed in the night and the wife was inconsolable. Essentially, the man had tried to get out of bed that night to use the bathroom and fell and died on the floor. When they found him, rigor had set in and his hands were outstretched. The wife saw him frozen like that and lost her mind with guilt because he'd probably been asking for help, but she didn't hear. That was the most gruesome that I heard about. I was a stupid fucking 14-year-old who got involved with some older kids. We were breaking into houses, and one we broke into, there was an older lady who I guess had been dead for a little while there. I didn't see it long. The older kids in our group had enough sense to get my brother and I, who was also 14 at the time, out of the house as soon as possible. I'm not sure what became of it, but I remember getting home really late that night and both of us throwing up once the adrenaline wore off. I dog sit for a friend on my days off. I usually take a road that goes behind my house out toward the airport, but this one morning I got out to the stoplight there and there were cops and a fire truck on the other side of the intersection, completely blocking my path. I had to take the left turn and go the back way. As I got to the highway, I remembered I forgot some stuff I needed back home. I took a turn that led back toward the intersection that was blocked. Figured I'd be fine since the other direction toward my house was open. As I got to the intersection, I got to see the issue. There was an SUV basically wrapped around a light post. I got up closer to the light and looked over to see they had cut the passenger side of the vehicle open and there was a man strewn/slumped across the center console from the driver's seat into the passenger side. Turns out that the man, the driver, had lost control of the vehicle after hitting a puddle on the road from the rain. The vehicle hit the post with such force that he died there. His wife I think maybe survived. Last I checked she was in the air with severe injuries. Every time I drive by the makeshift memorial his friends and family left, it breaks my heart. My mom and I were visiting my grandparents in Nova Scotia back when I lived in Canada as a young child and we took a trip to one of the big piers in Halifax. We stopped at a McDonald's on the pier so my grandma could use the bathroom. So my mom and I took a seat on this bench outside that was set along the wall of the McDonald's. An important note here is that the bench had a backrest to it, as well as a metal piece that covered the front to the ground, so you couldn't see behind the bench. Well, as we were sitting on said bench, a lady is walking by and points to the bench and says something about some shoes. My mom, not using her eyes, reaches down and grabs a shoe that is definitely attached to a foot. My mom screams, and we get off the bench to find that there was a dead homeless guy just lying underneath. The weird part of this story is that when we told the McDonald's that there was a dead guy underneath their bench, it has the big McDonald's M on it, so it wasn't a city bench. They absolutely refused to call the police. This was a time before cell phones. Eventually the cops show up and pull the body out, and this guy had a big knife just stuck in his chest, and he was covered in a ton of glass shards/dust. The cops told my mom that he must have been killed that night, and then whoever killed him dragged his body behind the bench out of sight.